Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum in Springfield, Illinois. I'm Joe Crane, the Director of Public Programs and Community Engagement. We welcome you to another Facebook Live being broadcast all across the state of Illinois, around the country, and around the world for that matter. And we certainly welcome you to join us throughout the next half hour to 45 minutes to an hour or so for conversation and a unique look at some of the interesting items in our collection here at the ALPLM. As always, we invite you to let us know where you're watching from tonight in the comments section. And of course, if you have some comments as we go through the hour, we welcome those as questions as well. Of course, we'll try to answer as many questions as we possibly can throughout the hour. Well, we're on the heels of Halloween, of course, just this past weekend. And we thought it would be interesting to kind of dive into the collection here at the ALPLM for some of the odd, the unusual, the creepy, and the downright bizarre. And believe it or not, we certainly have a good number of items that fit the bill, as we'll discover in tonight's presentation with the Chief of Acquisitions for the ALPLM, Ian Hunt. Good evening, Ian.
Good evening, Joe.
Of course, for now, we are all in Illinois, masked up to help prevent the spread of the coronavirus here during this mitigation phase that we're now dealing with as we head toward the end of the year. So with that in mind, Ian, I'm going to step safely away to the back of the room and give you the opportunity to take your mask off so everybody can see you and hear you a little bit better during the presentation as we kind of go into an interesting theme, how technology and a revival in spiritualism kind of come together about the same time as the Civil War, leading to an interesting phenomenon of how we think about death through the late part of the 19th century into the early 20th century, and then we'll kind of evolve from there and pick up an interesting story a little bit later on, more in modern times, of how a teenager went on a crime spree here in Illinois and then would later go on to become one of the most notorious and feared criminals easily in American history.
Yes.
So let's start with the program tonight, Ian. Go back to the 1840s, I'm guessing, about the time that photography started to come of age.
That's right, Joe. We'll go ahead and remove this so it's a little easier for us to talk. The middle of the 19th century saw a complete revival in spiritualism. You saw a lot of different entities that had decided that there were new ways that those who had been lost should be recalled, they should be remembered. You saw in the 1830s and 40s many of the larger cities in the United States and actually in Europe as well, they began to move cemeteries, for instance, outside of the urban areas. They move them into the more rural settings. First of all, they're running out of space for many of these cemeteries, but also there is this evolving belief that families should have an opportunity to be able to go and actually commune with their lost loved ones. They should be in a more idyllic setting, a pastoral setting, a park-like setting, if you will. So a lot of the major cemeteries that we know today were built kind of in that mindset, this notion that you would have these kind of beautiful areas in which people would be able to go and be able to spend time with their lost loved ones. In fact, Oak Ridge Cemetery right here in Springfield, where Mr. Lincoln is buried, was built in that exact same theme. When the cemetery was originally laid out, it was actually beyond the borders of the city of Springfield. And of course, when Mary Lincoln in 1865 declared that her husband would be buried at Oak Ridge, many were initially taken aback. They could not believe that the great martyred hero of the nation would be buried in what today would be considered essentially a rural country cemetery. Now, in the modern era, of course, Springfield has encompassed Oak Ridge, and it is one of the largest cemeteries in Illinois. I believe it's one of the largest cemeteries in the country. But there are other factors that are coming into play as well in the 19th century. You have the rise of photography, of course. With photography, you now have that ability to capture the image of those who are loved and certainly those who are lost. The American Civil War really brings a new revolution for photography to America. It gives people an opportunity that they had never before had to be able to see kind of the terror of war, the horrors of war. Previously, if you had not been in combat yourself, war was often portrayed as idealistic, it was portrayed as romantic, it was portrayed as something that great heroes went off on as adventures, grand events. And what you see is photographers like Alexander Gardner and Matthew Brady, they're going out on the battlefields and they are capturing the images of war in a way that most people do not expect. So one of the first images we're going to talk about here is this one. This was originally attributed to Matthew Brady, although it's later been believed that one of his staff photographers probably took it. It is simply entitled Dead Confederate in the Trenches at Fort Mahone in Virginia. The individual in the photograph is, of course, dead. That is macabre enough on its own right, but when you look at the picture more closely, you pretty quickly figure out, if you've studied military uniforms, military equipment from that era, that there are a lot of things that are not right in this picture. And it reveals that, that unfortunately, Mr. Brady's photographers and Mr. Brady himself were not above posing the dead. They would sometimes drag bodies to different parts of the battlefield. They would place different weapons on or around them, trying to create a much more dramatic scene. Here you have, again, the dead Confederate soldier. He has an 1861 Colt pattern musket laying across his chest, and then a damaged rifle laying just beyond. The barrel of it seems to have been broken. And some historians have even believed that this was probably a makeshift litter that was used by the photographers to move this poor man's body around so that they could get a very good image, or get what they felt was a really halting image. You see a lot of this type of photography that comes out of the war. Lots and lots of images after the Battle of Antietam, lots of images after the Battle of Gettysburg. Sometimes dozens and dozens of soldiers lined up dead in a row, other times just one individual like this one who was posed in a certain scene in a certain way. This really captured most Americans. It was a side of war, it was a side of life that they were not used to in any way. This, of course, led to lots of photographs in the future being used to document the loss of life. This is actually a photograph from the early 20th century. This is not from war. This is actually from the Cherry Mine disaster in northern Illinois. The Cherry Mine in Cherry, Illinois caught fire and suffered a massive loss of life. And in this postcard, picture postcard that you could have purchased and you could have mailed to your family or friends, it actually shows some of the recovered bodies from the mine fire that are wrapped simply in linen cloth.
What would the caption say? Because usually a lot of postcards have at least a little brief caption on the back of it to tell you what you're looking at. That just seems like such a macabre card to send to someone.
The caption, actually handwritten on the front of this, says, "Remains of victims of Cherry Mine disaster." From they've got three different dates here. They've got March 12th of 10, they've got November 13th of 09, and March of 1910. And then on the back, somebody has just simply written Cherry Mine disaster. So it appears that whoever purchased this just kept it as a personal memento. They never intended to actually mail it, although I have absolutely no doubt that others just exactly like this and of a similar nature were probably mailed by people. But this was held on to as a memento. We do know that some of the families that lost loved ones in that disaster had a tendency to purchase these kinds of things and hold on to them. So,
now going back to the war photos that you said really changed people's perception of how war was viewed in its entirety at the time. We talked about this a little earlier this afternoon, that up until then, even in some of the periodicals of the time, like Frank Leslie's Illustrated Newspaper, when you would see the very detailed drawings by artists at the battlefield, those views and images, even though some were violent in nature, were almost romanticized in some ways compared to the the stark reality that photography could bring to it.
That is correct. Leslie's, other magazines of that type, they did their best to try to convey what was happening in the war, but yes, there is a certain glamour, there is a certain romanticism, there's a certain amount of respect that was always afforded to the people in those woodcut images. And I'm sure the artists themselves, even though they probably believed that they were being completely objective, you know, certainly their artistic talents, their artistic ideals would have come into play when creating these. A picture like this, there is very little artistic ideal. I mean, this poor man's body is left in the mud. You can see the tree branches that are laying around him. They were probably parts of defensive works. There is no romance. There is no glory in this picture. This is simply death and devastation. And it really affected people. Brady's photographs were purchased far and wide. Every time his photographers came back from a campaign, everybody wanted to see what was going to be the latest images that would be in the window of Brady's studio in Washington, D.C. Now, when you have people who are dying in combat or dying from natural causes, it certainly isn't limited just to warfare, people are going to wonder, you know, what is there beyond? Is there something beyond? Does life simply snuff out when the heartbeat stops, or is there something that we can look forward to in the future? And again, thanks to photography, you have images that are being created in the beginning completely by accident that give people hope, that give people this idea that, yes, there must be something beyond this life. This is an image taken in Ford's Theater, taken after the assassination of President Lincoln, and you will see what appears to be a ghost-like figure of a Union soldier essentially standing guard outside of the presidential box. You see an image like this, and on first glance, it's very hard to argue and say, well, that must not be a spirit. This must be something else. But the reality is that the photography process during the Civil War and even in the years after the war, it was certainly not the photography process that we know today. It was a process that frequently went on sometimes for minutes. To properly expose a photograph, you needed to be able to stand very still. If there was any movement whatsoever within the camera during the exposure time, and exposure times could last 30 seconds, they could last 3 minutes or longer, it would create these ghost-like images. So it was later determined that this was not actually the ghost of a soldier guarding the presidential box. It was actually just a soldier who had walked into the image briefly, realized that there were photographs being taken, and then quickly tried to exit the area. But his ghostly image was captured forever in this shot.
And was it situations like that that some photographers began to realize that there was perhaps money to be made?
Anytime that you can create something for those who have loved and lost, anytime that you can give them that link, that notion that the person that they have lost is either not completely gone or that they've gone to a better place even, there's always going to be an avenue for finance there, for money there. So during the war, you have a rise of what becomes known as spiritualism photography. And we have an example here. This is a famous CDV of John Wilkes Booth. And it's an actual photograph of Booth, but you would notice that just beyond Booth is the devil. And the devil is whispering in John Wilkes Booth's ear. He is telling him, of course, that he needs to not only assassinate the president, but he needs to attack the vice president, the secretary of state, and so on and so forth. So these kinds of photographs initially are going to frighten people, but then other photographers begin to realize that you can make photos that will benefit people, that will take their lost loved ones and put them back into this position.
Ian, could you tilt that photo? Yeah, okay, we've got a good shot of it now that you've laid it back down, because for a little bit it was kind of in the glare there, so we're good there.
So you have photographers who, like William Mumler, who begin to create specific spirit photographs. You could go to him, you could request to have a photo taken. It was believed to be legitimate at the time. It was believed that his process would render those who you had loved and lost in the room, in the moment with you, and he would capture their images. This is a photograph of a politician out of Louisiana. His name was Stephen Packard. He started with the Union Army during the Civil War and then later ended up in New Orleans as a Republican politician appointed by the Reconstruction government to oversee the state of Louisiana. He was briefly actually elected governor of Louisiana before being removed because there were claims that of voter fraud. Surprise. So what you have here is Mr. Packard, we'll say Governor Packard, in the lower portion, and then you have all of these kind of ghostly faces that are around him. I will tell you the truth, whether these are family members who have been lost or whether this is some kind of an item meant to mock Mr. Packard, I honestly do not know. We've done a lot of research on the image. We know him well, but why this image specifically was created, we cannot tell you. But there are supposedly 7 spirits that are surrounding Mr. Packard in this image. By the 1870s, the 1880s, 1890s, spiritualism is huge. Mediums are selling their services to anyone who has lost a loved one. They are claiming that they can connect with the dead, that they can give information about those who have been loved and lost, and there is a lot of money being made. A lot of people believe very deeply in this, a lot of very intelligent people. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, for instance, was a big proponent of spiritual photography and of spirit mediums, seances, so on and so forth. But you begin to see really by the late 19th and early 20th century, the cracks on the veneer of spirit photography really begin to show. You get a number of individuals who really feel like they've been taken advantage of. P.T. Barnum, for instance, actually went after William Mumler for his claims of being able to create spirit photographs, testified against him in a court case on fraud, proved that Mumler did not have this ability that he claimed, although for whatever reason the court later found Mr. Mumler not guilty of fraud. But P.T. Barnum felt that he had been vindicated in this case. Another very famous individual who sought to dispel these myths was Harry Houdini. Now, Houdini actually comes to spiritualism legitimately in the beginning. Houdini lost his mother, was desperate to try to contact her, desperate to see whether or not she was on the other side, so to speak. And he had reached out to a number of different mediums, hoping that they would be able to contact her. But pretty quickly, Houdini figures out that it is a hoax. It is a scam that is being perpetrated by individuals. And so Houdini actually sets out to do his best to try to debunk as many of these spiritualists as possible. He puts out a massive reward offered that anyone who could legitimately contact the dead and commune with them, speak with them, that he would give them $10,000. And he traveled all over the country offering these rewards and offering these opportunities. And many mediums tried. Many sat down with him and they would shake, the tables would begin to shake, and they would have these various visions, and they would begin to mumble in different languages. And every single time, Houdini would very quickly, because of course he was an escape artist and he was very keen at being able to look at the details of things, he would say, okay, you're shaking the table with your leg. He would say, okay, you're getting information clearly from somebody outside of the room. He always hoped that he would find legitimacy with this, but he never was able to. So the image that we have here is, of course, Houdini himself, bound by ropes as if he is in one of his famed escape attempts. And just beyond him is the ghost of the 16th president, sitting in a chair, kind of looking at Houdini as Houdini stares back at him. Houdini admitted that this was a joke. In fact, when he sent this image to Mary Edwards Brown, who was, of course, a niece of the Edwards family, who were related to Mary and Abraham Lincoln, he talked about it being a hoax. And in fact, on the back, he wrote, "Best wishes, Houdini." He actually signed it. And he said, trick spirit photo. So.
At what point did he take that photo? Was it close to the time? Because unfortunately, he had an untimely demise with one of his other challenges for people punching him in the stomach, and of course was unprepared for that. Was that close to that time?
This is 1924 that this picture is taken. So he doesn't have long after that left. Staying with the theme of Lincoln and spirits, this is just kind of a fun one that we have here in the collection. This was actually put together by our friends down at the Lemp Mansion in St. Louis, Missouri, which has long been credited as being supposedly one of the most haunted homes in America. They have taken a classic photograph of Mr. Lincoln, and they have given him the Ghostbusters proton pack that he is wearing on his back, and they have given him what almost appear to be night vision goggles atop his head. I have seen Mr. Lincoln in many different incarnations in photographs and different graphics today. That was the first time I had ever seen him as a Ghostbuster. So we included that because if you're going to be talking about spirits in Lincoln, you certainly need to talk about Lincoln busting spirits, I think.
Good stuff. Of course, we're watching Facebook Live from the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. The topic tonight, Tales from the Vault series. We're looking at the odd, the unusual, the creepy, and sometimes the downright bizarre items from our collection with our Chief of Acquisitions, Ian Hunt. And we've gone through the convergence of spirituality and photography, and just interesting to see how people approached death back in, especially in the time just following and during and just following the Civil War, and that need to connect with their loved ones. But as we move into the earliest 20th century, as you mentioned, some of that's being debunked, but yet the idea of spirituality and times of war is still a prevalent theme with some folks by that time.
Absolutely. So, one of the most famous residents of Springfield, Illinois, not named Abraham Lincoln, was the great poet Vachel Lindsay. Now, Mr. Lindsay wrote a number of great poems, but this one is of special interest tonight. It's entitled Abraham Lincoln Walks at Midnight in Springfield. Now, this poem has actually been written, and all of the artwork on it was done by Lindsay himself, and it's written more than 15 years after the original poem was written. So this copy was made in 1930. But this poem was originally written in 1914. And Lindsay was greatly troubled by the fact that the world was facing the First World War, that once again, the world was seeing death and destruction on a level that it had not seen in years, certainly not since the American Civil War. And Lindsay's poem essentially talks about that Lincoln's ghost will be forced to walk the streets of Springfield, essentially for eternity, as long as men will continue to kill each other needlessly, as long as there is violence, as long as there is murder, as long as there is warfare. That Lincoln's ghost will never be able to rest. The last couple of stanzas on this are very moving. Lindsay says, "He cannot rest until a spirit dawn shall come, the shining hope of Europe free, the league of sober folk, the workers' earth, bringing long peace to cornland, Alp, and sea." So in Lindsay's mind, until peace could be everywhere, not just in the United States, but literally everywhere on the globe, we would be forced to deal with this kind of reckoning. What makes this even sadder is the fact that Mr. Lindsay, he had achieved a great deal of success early in his career. 1914 to about 1920 was really the highlight of his career. He made quite a bit of money. He was considered one of the best poets in the country. He was being thrown in league with Edgar Lee Masters, with Carl Sandburg. There were poets who were ascribing to be like him. He was friends with Sarah Teasdale, for instance, a great female poet from St. Louis. But by 1930, his fortunes had changed dramatically. He had actually courted Sarah Teasdale and proposed marriage to her, but was refused. He had moved around the country quite a bit. As a, I believe, 40-year-old man, he married a 24-year-old young woman in Oregon and suddenly felt a much greater need that he needed to provide for this new family that he had. He moves back to Springfield, back to his childhood home, which actually still stands today. It's a state historic site, just literally 4 or 5 blocks from where we're standing right now. But he just simply cannot gain the success that he had 10 years earlier, 15 years earlier. He is frantically crisscrossing the country, trying to amass as much money as he can, giving performances and things of that nature. But the style of poetry, the culture had changed. And so unfortunately for Mr. Lindsay, he's just never going to be able to capture that spirit that he had had at that one time. This poem that he wrote out here and gave to a friend is just about 13 months before he will die. So there's not much time left on this earth for Mr. Lindsay when he's recounting this great poem. So.
But also, I think, too, one of the things that I find striking about that piece is, at least in the artwork and obviously toward the end of the poem, he's hopeful that the time of war will result in a prolonged period of peace. But also the artwork that he does on that seems to be very optimistic in view as well.
It is. You have what appear to be sunflowers at both the top and the bottom that are overlapping the writing itself. It's all handwritten by Lindsay himself. He not only signed it, but he gave his full address and the date as well. I guess in case somebody lost it, they could return it to him. It's a beautiful piece aesthetically. It is certainly a beautiful poem. Even though it has a fairly sad, a fairly macabre theme to it. But it is, Lindsay wrote a lot about Mr. Lincoln. He certainly understood the significance of Mr. Lincoln in Lindsay's time, and he knew he was writing about the most famous resident of Springfield when he would talk about Lincoln. In some of his other writings, he really recognizes the importance and significance of Mr. Lincoln. So,
now, of course, at the time of World War I, it was a period where people saw death and destruction at a level unlike they had seen since the Civil War. And folks like Houdini were trying to debunk the idea of spirituality and photography, but was it still as prevalent at that time as far as a lot of people grasping onto it, or had society become just a little more sophisticated and a little more skeptical of such claims from photographers by the time World War I rolled around?
By the time World War I rolls around, a lot of the early spirit photographers have been run out of business. They've been proven to be frauds. But people are still not giving up on this notion that you can still capture these images of those that have been loved and lost. There are books that are being written in 1910, 1915, 1920 that talk about, capturing spirit photography and following up on these kinds of ideas, these notions that you should be able to commune with those who you have loved and lost. And as I said earlier, the veneer on spirit photography is certainly cracking, but there are a lot of people who are still trying to buy into this notion. And, you know, there's some nobility to it, this belief that you could maybe speak to or even just know that the people that you'd loved were in a better place or in a happier place. I can see a lot of people in times of global conflict grabbing a hold of an idea like that and doing their best to try to make it come true.
Well, here we are about the halfway point of the 7 o'clock hour on this Thursday evening with our Facebook Live from the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum, joined by Ian Hunt, who is our Chief of Acquisitions for the ALPLM. We certainly invite your questions for Ian tonight about our subject at hand. Just post them in the comments. Already a lot of folks just letting us know where you're watching from. Tonight we've got folks watching from Wisconsin, Michigan, looks like Texas, Arkansas, among other places, a number of locations around Illinois as well. So let us know where you're watching from. We always are curious about that. And of course, if you have some questions and comments for us, we welcome those as well. And I think I see a interesting question coming in here. Before we move on to our next topic here, somebody commenting that they said spiritualism in the mid-19th century, the development of photography technology, and Abraham Lincoln as a Ghostbuster. So they certainly see how things certainly got put together in that way. That comment from Scott. Thanks for checking in with us tonight on that, Scott. But yeah, certainly interesting to see how technology and a desire to be connected to lost loved ones came together so prominently there for about, a 50, maybe 60-year stretch overall before it really fell out of favor.
Yes.
Now let's move on to our third part of our program this evening. When you were telling me about this story a couple, 3 weeks ago, this one I just find fascinating that what was really at the time a simple teenage crime spree was conducted by someone here in Illinois who would eventually move out west and become one of the most notorious criminal crime figures of the 20th century. Where do we start with this story?
This story actually begins several years ago, begins back in 2017. Perhaps we should talk about how we actually acquired this material. There was a newspaper reporter out of Peoria, Illinois, who said that he had this series of letters and he wasn't sure what to do with them. He had received them in the course of his work. He did not want these items to fall into the wrong hands, but at the same time, he did not really think that it was appropriate to destroy them or for him to hold on to them himself. So he was looking for an appropriate home for them. So he and I talked several times, and we realized that these letters encompassed a story about Illinois that I myself had never heard. I've studied Illinois history for a good part of my professional life. I had absolutely no clue that these events had ever occurred. And so he decided that the Lincoln Presidential Library would probably be the best place for these items. The story is of a young Charles Manson. Charles Manson in 1992 was written to by this Peoria newspaper reporter because he had heard a story that Manson had been arrested in Peoria on a burglary charge following his escape from a boys' town about 40 years before that, and he wanted to find out whether or not the story was true. And Mr. Manson, Charles Manson, actually took the original letter that was written by our reporter, which you can see, it's got the Peoria Journal-Star letterhead on the top with all of the typed letter from Mr. Luciano, and he started telling his story. Charles Manson started telling his story about how he ended up in Peoria and really what he thought about it. And it is both chilling and fascinating at the exact same time. to find out that when Manson, as a young man, as a teenager, actually escaped from a boys' town in Nebraska, I believe.
Yes, Omaha.
He and another inmate who he escaped with initially made their way, I believe, to Idaho, but then decided that they were going to head to Illinois because his co-conspirator, his fellow escape artist, had an uncle who lived in the Peoria housing projects and was running the numbers and running the rackets for some of the Chicago mobs for the Peoria area. So Charles Manson and his friend make the trip to Peoria. They spent several weeks in the city, and he talks a lot about how much fun he had in Peoria. He goes into great detail about how they are robbing various locations, they're stealing the safes out of various businesses, they are taking them to the train bridge, the railroad trestles that would cross the Illinois River, and they were throwing the safes off of the railroad trestles so that when they would strike the ground, they would explode and open up. They would get all of the material out of it. He just, it's kind of a, and I don't know how much you can see of that, but it's kind of a very rambling, it goes on and on and on about all of this experience and how much he just loved basically spending his time in Peoria. In fact, he even says in the letters that, Peoria has a very special place in his heart. That he had been to places like Chicago and St. Louis and they were just too big, but that Peoria was just the right size and Peoria was the right flavor for him. He really is passionate about his time in Peoria. Unfortunately, once he gets done telling the stories, he does what I guess most criminals do. He begins to ask Mr. Luciano if he will send him money, if he will send him phones in prison, if he will send him whatever he can try to get him to. Mr. Luciano refused to send anything. But it's a fascinating story. Of course, when this happens, this would have been 1952. So we are still more than a decade away from the summer of 1969, the summer of Helter Skelter, when Manson amasses a group of followers that he believes he will be able to start a race war, and that eventually African Americans will win this race war, but that they will need a white leader, Charles Manson, to lead them. And so he hopes with those killings, the Sharon Tate and the LaBianca killings, that he's going to initiate this war. This is why they famously spread the word pigs in blood on the crime scenes. This is why they did some of the other really unspeakable acts in those crime scenes, because they were really just hoping that this would be kind of the tipping point and that the country would really come unglued at that point. Thankfully, Mr. Manson's hopes, dreams, plans certainly did not come to fruition. Manson and his followers were arrested. Manson himself was charged with 9 counts of murder, even though he always claimed that he never took part in any of the actual killings, that those were his followers' job, that he was simply giving them the directions that they needed. And initially, in California, he was sentenced to death. But within a year or two of him going into the California Correctional Institute, the California State Supreme Court revised its statutes on the death penalty. And so Mr. Manson's death sentence was commuted to life without the possibility of parole. So I don't know if these letters had been written, 10 years earlier, 20 years earlier, whether they would have been more coherent, whether they would have been clearer in their appearance. Certainly in 2017, or well, these originals were written in 1992. Mr. Manson had been in prison for more than 2 decades at that point. So what effect that may have had on him, we will never know. But I can tell you in 1969, he was able to convince a small handful of people to do some incredibly heinous things.
And going back to his time in Peoria, of course, up until some reform movements by civic leaders in the late 50s, early 60s, Peoria was kind of typical of a lot of river towns. It kind of had a wide open atmosphere with regards to gambling and drinking and other forms of vice. And so it would be kind of understandable, someone that has a bit of a criminal bent and a wild streak to them found Peoria such a fascinating place in the early 1950s.
Yeah. The line that is most striking to me, certainly if any of our viewers are watching from Peoria, he writes, "That town always been good to me. It's not too big like LA or St. Louis, yet big enough to get lost into."
And you say he was arrested at one point in Peoria, or?
He was. Well, I'll just read you right here. He talks about that they were backing out of a car dealership they'd broken into, and were caught by Peoria City Police as they were coming out. It's a very long, very kind of, like I say, rambling letter. I should have found
which was much like many of the interviews that he gave over the years on the times that he did do an interview for television or documentary makers. Interesting question here. Joyce wants to know, saying Boys Town was not a prison, yet his departure from there is termed as an escape. Was that his words, or how it was determined at the time? What were the circumstances on that when he left Boys Town?
His specific writing, his specific wording is, "I ran out of Boys Town, stole a car in Lincoln, Nebraska, and railed to Idaho, stole a hearse next, and ran with a kid named Vern Blackhand," where he then goes into detail about who's going to the Peoria housing projects, where his uncle ran the numbers out of Chicago, Illinois. So he portrays it as escaping. And I know my limited knowledge of Charles Manson's criminal career, he was in and out of various institutions as a teenager in Indiana, in Nebraska, here in Illinois. I believe with the arrest in Illinois, he was actually returned to the Boys Town. He was not incarcerated here in the state of Illinois. He had a habit of, he would go to one of these facilities for a year or two, and for several cases, he actually committed more heinous crimes while he was in these facilities, and he would get pushed to a higher level, a more maximum security facility. He would do something else. He was attacking fellow inmates. There are claims that he was assaulting them. So he was continually being pushed through the system. He enjoys, in the mid-1960s, he enjoys a brief turn of popularity, actually. He gets into the music industry in Los Angeles. He actually writes a song that the Beach Boys use on one of their albums. He is trying to break into the music industry, but he just can't seem to get beyond just the fringe of that industry. That's really in the mid-1960s and late 1960s where you begin to see him make that change, and you begin to see the creation of the Manson family, where he's bringing together these followers, and he's creating this idea of a race war that will ultimately destroy the country.
But interesting, some of the early aspects of his criminal life were in Peoria there in 1952.
Yes.
A number of folks chiming in with some questions tonight. Ian, as we have a few minutes for some questions, getting back to the spiritualism and photography and whatnot. Luann asked, was there a resurgence of spiritualism during the 1918 flu, the pandemic back then?
You see this anytime that there are wars, anytime that there are pandemics, anytime that there seems to be massive loss of life, where people are searching for answers. People are having a difficult time grasping that those that are close to them have been lost. And yes, you see these things, they kind of pop back up, they kind of take hold, and then frequently, they begin to peter out again very quickly. Usually because even though there may be one family member who is engaged in this notion, there are almost always other family members who will try to step in and point out that individuals are simply being conned, that they're having their hard-earned money taken away from them and not being given something in return, not something truthful at least in return. So I think anytime that you see these kinds of loss of life, pandemic, disaster, war, people are always going to try to search for answers.
Well, one of our cohorts here at the ALPLM, Chris Wills, asking a question as he's watching tonight, wanting to know what's your favorite non-Lincoln item that you're showing from the collection tonight under the categories of the odd, the unusual, the creepy, and the just downright bizarre.
It's not a very fair question, Chris. I probably would have to say, well, he keeps saying non-Lincoln. So much of this is Lincoln-focused. I was going to say the Vachel Lindsay poem, just for its beauty, but it's all about Lincoln. Probably the image of the soldier in the trenches at Fort Mahone, just because of its graphic nature, because it takes away the glories, the romanticism of war, and shows war for the ugliness that it truly is. The people who always clamor the loudest for war are the people who have never seen war. And this is a great reminder for people that it may seem like a grand adventure, but it's an incredibly terrible thing.
Brian, talking about Vachel Lindsay, wants to know if you could discuss a little bit of Vachel Lindsay and the statue in Charleston, if you're familiar with that.
The statue in Charleston.
Yes. So.
Unfortunately, I will not be able to discuss Vachel Lindsay and the statue in Charleston because I'm not familiar. Is it a statue of Lindsay, or is it...
Not for sure. He just says, could you discuss Vachel Lindsay and the statue in Charleston? So, State Historic Site, Springfield. Not for sure about that. Okay.
Wouldn't be the first time I've been stumped.
What's that?
Wouldn't be the first time I've been stumped.
That's okay. Stump the band here tonight. Charlie writes in, how did the museum acquire the picture of Harry Houdini with Abraham Lincoln in the picture? There's got to be a unique story to that because that's not your usual everyday item that you come across.
No, and this is an image. I'm not sure whether this image was ever published by Houdini. The reason that we ended up with it, again, is because Mr. Houdini sent the image to Mary Edwards Brown, who was, of course, a relative of the Lincoln family, and it came to us through her family. It came to us through her papers. So that is how we ended up with this specific one. Mary Edwards Brown was the great-granddaughter of Ninian Wirt Edwards, Illinois' first territorial governor. Ninian Wirt Edwards, his son, who was the brother-in-law to Abraham and Mary Lincoln. So she is a family member, and Houdini sent it to her and signed it for her. Best wishes, Houdini. But it came to us through her papers.
Well, Ian Hunt, our Chief of Acquisitions, it's been an incredibly informative and interesting evening diving into a subject that obviously is very much a part of the life cycle, but a lot of people don't necessarily like to talk about it, but at the same time, they're very fascinated, as evidenced by all as one person wondered why so many people continue to be fascinated by people like Charlie Manson. I guess it probably has something to do with our just wondering how someone else could become so detached from what we consider as normal behavior of society, I suppose. But nonetheless, interesting subject matter tonight, and we thank you for your time with us, and of course invite you to join us again next week. We have a couple of special times for our Facebook Lives. Of course, Wednesday is Veterans Day. That day, the museum, of course, open from 9 till 5, but we have free admission for all veterans. We invite veterans to call the museum guest services in advance to get your tickets, and of course show your ID, military ID, when you arrive. That night at 7 o'clock, we will have Dr. Mark Depew with Vince Speranza, a gentleman who's well into his 90s, but you wouldn't know it by his energy and enthusiasm. Of course, he was part of World War II, the greatest generation, but in ensuing years, some 65 years later, he discovered that something he did at the Battle of the Bulge has become the stuff of legend in Belgium lore. So he will share his life's experiences since then, how he's kind of become a little bit of a celebrity as a result in parts of the world. So we'll have that next Wednesday night at 7 o'clock here on Facebook, and then at noon on Thursday next week, our Illinois History Forum, Mark Floto, a local editor and historian researcher, will talk to Dr. Depew about his book on Civil War letters. We'll hear firsthand the words of Civil War soldiers from back in the day in Illinois in the 1860s. So that'll be coming up next Thursday at noon right here on Facebook. Ian Hunt, again, our Chief of Acquisitions here at the ALPLM. Thank you, Ian. A wonderful presentation tonight, and we thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Joe.
Have a good night, everybody. Thank you for watching the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum in Springfield.